Buddy, and welcome to the webinar Suicide Talk, a conversation to create awareness with Lori Hoffner. Thank you all for joining us today. My name is Dan Hendy, and I'm the Education Manager with the Pennsylvania Rec and Park Society. Before we get started, I'd like to mention a few housekeeping points. And I'm trying to switch slides here. This webinar is being recorded. Participants are muted during this webinar. However, possibly at the end of the presentation, we will open up the mics for your questions. In addition to the Q&A period, you can also submit questions or comments in the chat box or the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. We'll either address them during the webinar or at the end. In a few days, you'll receive a link to the recorded webinar via email. This webinar has been approved for 0.1 CEUs or 1 contact hour. The final presentation slide will have a link to the quiz and instructions. Make sure you take the quiz immediately following the presentation. A little bit of background about who we are. The Pennsylvania Rec and Park Society is the principal statewide association providing professional development, advocacy, and resources for those working and volunteering in parks and recreation. We provide our members with industry news, research and trends, legislative advocacy, technical assistance, current resources, and many professional development opportunities and networking events throughout the year. Now I'd like to introduce our speaker. We feel very lucky today to have Lori Hoffner with us. Lori has been offering training in positive youth development, community network, and organizational relationship building since 1997. Through her experience in the aftermath of the Columbine tragedy, she has become a leader in the field of helping youth and the communities and organizations that serve them. And now it's time for me to hand everything over to Lori. I'm going to stop my sharing.
Dan, I will pull up mine. First thing I want to do, I'm going to do this first just to say hi to everybody. I'm so glad that everyone is able to join today and participate in this very, very important conversation. So I am now going to share my screen, put up the slides. Let's hope that all of the tech gods are with us. There we go. Can everybody see the slides? I'm hoping that everybody can see it. If you don't, chat, give me a heads up in the chat box. And of course, I'm having problems because my slides aren't moving. Let's try share again. There we go. All right, hopefully everybody can see that, and we're going to be able to move through the slides. As we have this conversation today about suicide and the importance of our awareness to the issue of suicide, the one thing that I want us to remember is how important it is for us to take care of each other, that we are recognizing how important this topic is. And for some people, it can be very, very challenging. Maybe you've had a personal experience with suicide, someone close to you. Maybe you've worked with individuals in the programs that you offer with PRPS that has influenced individuals and has had an impact with suicide. Whatever it is, I want you to know that I want to do everything I can to keep you safe, and I need your help in doing that. So one of the things that we can do to keep each other safe is know what some of our immediate resources are. And one of the resources that we're going to talk about, and I'll mention this several times in our time together today, is the Suicide Prevention Lifeline. And that number that is listed here is a 24-hour, 7-day-a-week hotline that you can use for anybody. Anybody can call this number. So if you're having, if you're in conversation with somebody that you're concerned about, maybe it's somebody very close to you, maybe it's a colleague, it might even be you. I want you to know that this number is available to you. You can also text TALK to 741-741. That's the text line for the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. Let's do what we can to keep each other safe as we move through this conversation. So the first thing that I'm going to do is share with you a lot of different statistics. I want to make sure that you are aware of the scope of the issue with suicide. And I'm going to share a lot of different numbers. I'm going to go through this kind of quickly, but I just want you to be aware of the impact of this issue. You know, right now, the numbers are increasing, and we understand why. This pandemic has changed our world, and access to resources, people feeling a bit desperate with job loss or being furloughed or whatever the impact might be. Certainly even the health issues can trigger some folks. So we need to be aware of the scope of the issues and how we might be able to address it and the impact that it has in each of our communities. So this is one of the important pieces of information. Now, if you downloaded the slides, and I hope that you did, but if you did download those slides, you'll see that in the slides, the dates that I have for you are 2018. Come on into the century, Lori. 2018. And I was able to find even more current numbers. So these are the current numbers for Pennsylvania. And you'll see that in Pennsylvania, suicide is the 11th leading cause of death overall. And what's interesting is when you look through that blue box there where it says the 11th leading cause of death, you can see by different demographics of ages the impact that suicide is having, and where it's the second leading cause of death for young people between the ages of 10 into adulthood of 34. So some really important information there. So if you wanted those more up-to-date numbers, you have the link in the handouts where you can get that. So let's move on to some of the statistics for our young people and the impact that suicide is having, just again to create awareness for us. Now, I mentioned that in Pennsylvania, it is the second leading cause of death for individuals between the ages of 10 to 34, and that's a pretty large span of age for individuals that are at risk for suicide. Nationally, it is the second leading cause of death for individuals between the ages of 15 to 24. Here in Colorado, it is 10 to 24. So each state varies, but on average throughout the nation, second leading cause of death for young people between the ages of 15 to 24. Now, what's important about that is that the suicide rate for youth has increased approximately 22%, and that's a very, very significant increase. So something for us to be aware of, something for any of you that are working with young people. I've tried to stay up to date about how many camps with different parks and rec agencies throughout the state, throughout the nation are taking place. And I know in Pennsylvania, there are some that are in-person kind of camps, as well as you're doing as much as you can online for young people. Please know how at risk our young people are right now in general, but certainly with this pandemic. What we can do and the impact that we can have is understand how our involvement with young people makes a difference. For example, these particular statistics right here, that if a young person has a trusted adult that they know that they can go to, that can be you. It might be one of the young people that you work with in your program. It might be a young person that works for you. It could be a kid in your neighborhood. Please know that just by having that trusted adult, you can reduce the risk of suicide by 3.5%. School safety. Now, school safety is really interesting when we think about prior to the pandemic. School safety was all about how we kept our kids safe, with the active shooter drills. And what's interesting is how that is now proving to put kids at higher risk. So other ways that we can create school safety. When a young person feels safe at school, they're approximately 3% less likely to attempt suicide. So think about what you can offer. Think about the programs that you can offer that helps to create school safety. And then, of course, extracurricular activities, so everything that you guys provide for young people in the community. It also helps to reduce risk for young people. Now, these might seem like very small numbers, but it has such an impact, and it can go higher depending on our involvement. So the work that you do and the impact that you have makes a tremendous difference. When we talk about our adult community, this is some numbers from 2018 based on the demographics of race and or culture, and looking at suicide risk. So it's important for us to understand the impact that different races, different cultures have with the issue of suicide. The Native American, indigenous populations throughout are always our highest risk population. So if you work with any of the individuals in that community, again, just keep in mind, be aware of the level of risk that both adults and young people are. And then, of course, the demographics of LGBTQ and the transgendered adult, and a really high number here that talks about 40% of transgendered adults talk about an attempt of suicide at least by the age of 25. So that's pretty significant. When you talk about tolerance and acceptance, you can see the impact that that's going to have on the mental state of an individual. So some other numbers regarding adults, that around the world, every 3 minutes, somebody between the ages of 25 to 34 dies by suicide. And 55 to 79, those individuals 59 to 79, 300 people each day die by suicide. Again, just to give us an idea, a scope of the issue. And then for those of you who work with our senior population, and those of you who provide programs or any type of connection, and such a positive impact that it has. Because again, the statistic around the world that more than 5 people over the age of 80 die by suicide every hour. And that's kind of a startling number when you think about somebody kind of in the golden years, if you will, of life. But we talk about quality of life. So warning signs for that person that that loneliness, maybe health issues, independence, significant life changes. Now, again, think about the pandemic and significant life changes. When we think about how much more isolated our senior population is, and how important it is that we be aware that of suicide risk for them and what we might be able to do. Any type of connection that we can make, any type of interaction to reduce that loneliness, to provide a safe conversation for those individuals can make all the difference. And that's exactly what you do when you work with your senior population. In general, nationally, numbers for adults, you can see here, this tells us the differences between 65 and older, up to 65. This just kind of gives us an idea of the scope of the issue for our adult population. Another thing to be aware of is related to occupation. And individuals who are in the construction field are one of our highest risk groups in terms of occupation. And then anybody in rural communities, those suicide rates in rural communities are extremely high as well. And it's important for us to remember that in terms of rural, it's access to resources. Again, it's that isolation factor. Now, it's difficult in rural communities and parks and recreation. How do you reach out to them? What does that look like? But again, this is just an opportunity for us to be aware of the scope of the issue. I wanted to show you here a couple of other studies that have been done related to occupation and the risk of suicide. You can see that the 17 states that the CDC reported on, and this was a study that was done in 2016, it it shows the farming, fishing, and forestry. And when you think about some of our park rangers, they're at one of the occupations that are at higher risk, and construction of, again, up there at the top as well. So this just kind of gives us an idea. This is, again, very specific to those 17 states. And here are some numbers that are a national rating of occupations and those who are at higher risk. So if you take a look at that, I have to say what I like is that those individuals that are in kind of the physical activity, that personal care and service, that might mean more of our therapeutic recreation individuals, a little bit lower risk. But what we're finding right now in the midst of this pandemic is this compassion fatigue, and the numbers are actually climbing for individuals that are in the healthcare, that are in that service type, that personal service type of industry. Those numbers are climbing because of compassion fatigue. So again, just an opportunity for us to see the scope of the issue. So as this says, the factors related to occupation, it helps us understand that we need to be willing to talk openly about suicide and support each other in challenging times. When we know how many people are furloughed or have lost their jobs, when we think about the number of individuals that are wondering what their jobs are going to look like, you know, we think about teachers and our kids going back to school, and if not, online teaching, and then so parents, their stress level goes up and more at risk. We have to be willing to talk openly about suicide. So we can see that whether it's occupation, it's an age demographic, possibly it's a cultural or a race demographic, sexual orientation, all of these different factors are important for us to know, to understand, and to be aware about the scope of the issue of suicide. Something that's extremely important for us to remember, that across all age groups and across all occupations, it is white males that account for 7 out of 10 suicides. Now, we know that most men are at higher risk for suicide because when they are in the act of suicide, they use a more lethal means. So that increases that number. Females are quickly catching up, but to date, men, white men, are our highest risk group. And another one of our highest risk group, as you saw before, white men 65 and older. So if you take just a second and think about the demographics that you work with, the programs that you provide, the people that you interact with, maybe you have park maintenance people, or maybe your therapeutic recreation, maybe you're working with the young people, and the impact that you can have, the difference that you can make for someone who might be struggling with thoughts of suicide. And I'm going to move us into how we might be able to make that difference. First, I want to find out if there are any questions that anyone has at this point that I can answer. I want to make sure that I'm able to give you responses that help you with any of the numbers, any of these statistics that I've been sharing. So don't hesitate at all to put a question in that chat box. And if by chance I miss it, I've got my amazing Director of Sales and Marketing, Jen Garber. She's on with us as well. She's going to make sure that I see those questions and those comments. So I'll move forward here with some of our information. This looks at our entire nation and the increase that we are seeing. And you will see that every single state, with the exception of one, every single state has had an increase in suicide. And this date ends in 2016. It's going to be very interesting when we start seeing numbers coming out of 2020. But the difference is Nevada, and I want to speak to that. But you can take a look and see what the increases are across the United States and the increase in the rates of suicide. Nevada is really unique. When I started doing suicide prevention and intervention training, I started this work in 2001. Nevada used to be one of the states that had the highest numbers of suicide, and there were a lot of theories, a lot of reasons that went behind that. And what Nevada did is they made a very intentional effort to reduce those numbers. They increased trainings in their state. They became much more intentional about the conversation of suicide, not being afraid to talk about it, understanding what the impact is of involving conversations with a lot of different groups like Parks and Recreation in how they can reduce the number of suicides. And that's why Nevada, out of all of the states, has actually seen a decrease. The dollars that they've put towards training efforts and education and more open conversation. So it is possible for us to have a decrease in the number of suicides. And it happens with conversations like this, with our willingness to engage in a very challenging topic of suicide. So here I'm going to ask that everyone participate in this one. I would like you, in that chat box, I want you to write one word, maybe a couple of words, whatever works best for you. But in one word, describe why you think there has been such an increase in suicide across the United States. Pre-pandemic, why do you think there's been such an increase in suicide across the United States? So if everybody would please take a moment and type their ideas in the chat box, that would be fantastic. I'd love to hear what you have to say about this. Everybody's waiting for that first person to do the chat, right? Well, as we go through this, again, just to honor time and hopefully encourage some participation here, I will move us forward. But if you're thinking about this and if you've come up with an idea of why you think there might be an increase in suicide rates across the United States, please put that in the chat box.
We do have a couple of answers, Lori.
We do have a couple of answers. I'm sorry, I apparently am missing them. Thank you, Dan. I am looking in my chat box. I'm not seeing it.
Well, in my chat, I have internet, lack of face-to-face communication, social media, girls can be very mean, expectations, cyberbullying, loneliness.
Fantastic. Dan, thank you so much. I appreciate that that you shared those with me. There they are. Wow, they popped up. Fantastic. Thank you. Goodness, I apologize for missing those. You know what? Yep, we know that young ladies can, well, let's just go with bullying, okay? Let's just talk about bullying. And we know that girls can be pretty good at bullying, and young men as well. Girls seem to own and deal with that bullying very, very differently. I like, Sherry, thank you so much for saying that lack of face-to-face communication because of social media, the internet, different expectations. Lori, thank you for saying that. I agree that really does make a difference. The cyberbullying, and so here's one of the things that I want to say. There is a report that was done by Dr. Jansen out of the University of North Carolina, Greensboro. She's actually done a full study that talks about the impact of internet and that social media component and the impact that it's having on young people. And it's fascinating because she has found that it is not having the impact, the mental health impact that a lot of people think that it does. What does make a difference, and it's exactly what Jackie put up here, was that cyberbullying. So when there's bullying involved, so it's not necessarily the involvement and the participation and all of that time spent on social media or the internet that is increasing risk for not only young people, but some adults as well. But it is the bullying that takes place there. So it's important that we make the distinction that it's not necessarily the time on that computer, that screen time, the internet, but it is the actions that are taking place, that cyberbullying. It does absolutely increase some loneliness for adults. We're seeing more loneliness for adults if they're only behind that screen. So that is definitely an impact there. I appreciate your willingness to participate. Sorry that the information wasn't popping up quickly for me, but I do appreciate your willing to participate in that. So I want us to now think about some other numbers that are increasing. All of the numbers that I have shared with you, those CDC numbers, do not include the military. Military keeps their own numbers. Those are completely different. So when we look at the military numbers, it's a staggering number when we think about it. There is approximately 22 active or veteran members of our military completing suicide every day. So staggering numbers when we think about it. And when we think about those veterans, I also want you to think about how many services, how many opportunities do you have to provide those programs or interactions for people in the military. There are, based on my research, I saw that there are 4 active military bases in the state of Pennsylvania. And when you look at knowing that there are 4 active military bases, you look at the numbers and the impact that it has. We know that there's a higher number with our younger male veterans. And then you see a jump, and our male veterans 55 and older are actually the highest count. So it's a real challenge for the military and that safety issue. I feel very, very fortunate that I've had the opportunity to do suicide prevention and intervention trainings on military bases. And I know that every branch of the military is working on this issue. Unfortunately, it continues to be a significant problem for them. The other thing that we need to talk about is the results of access to firearms and how the access to firearms increases the rates of suicide. So it's not a political statement. It is a safety statement related to firearms and suicides. And you will see that different states that have had some type of gun laws put in place, the reduction of suicide that takes place because of that. And when I talk about some of those gun laws, what we're talking about is in terms of the background checks, when we talk about safety of gun storage, those types of laws are making a difference when it comes to suicides and access to firearms and the rates of suicide. Whenever a firearm is present, a suicide is 4 times more likely to take place. So if someone is at risk of suicide, it is 4 times more likely when there is access to firearms. So that makes sense when we talk about the correlation between gun regulations in states and lower gun violence, in particular suicide. Finally, I want to talk about the financial cost of suicide. Overall, throughout the nation, it is approximately $93.5 billion, $93.5 billion related to suicide. And that is a total cost that is associated with both completed suicides and attempted suicides. So it's on average about $1.3 million per individual. Now these are both direct and indirect costs. And what I mean by that is 3% of that excuse me, that $1.3 million per individual, 97% of that is lost productivity. So those direct and indirect costs, only 3% are direct costs related to medical treatment. So there is a significant financial impact with suicides in our communities. So if there's no other reason to talk about why we have to be aware of suicide and the impact that it has in our communities, we can talk the dollars and the impact that it has on businesses. So if we can get people to talk about nothing else related to suicide, we can talk dollars with them as well. Once again, I want to put up this number so that we all have access to that information and understand the importance of resources. And this is, again, an immediate resource that we can be aware of and access at any time that we might need it, that National Suicide Prevention Hotline number. So I want to now talk about what we can possibly do. I've talked about the scope of the issue, and unfortunately some of those numbers are scary. Some of those numbers are makes us think, what on earth, what can we possibly do? Well, again, I want you to think about that state of Nevada. And when they were intentional about the conversation, when they were intentional about education and training, they were able to reduce numbers. And one of the ways that we can do that is recognizing warning signs, the warning signs that might be present for someone who is struggling with thoughts of suicide. So what I'm going to ask you all to do now is, if you would, in that chat box, if you would please type some of your thoughts of what you know, your general knowledge of what might be some of the warning signs that we might see from individuals who are struggling with thoughts of suicide. So again, just put that in the chat box and hopefully I'll be able to get that to pop up here again. And if I don't, Dan or Jen, if either one of you can let me know. Oh, it's showing up here. Dan, thank you. Yeah, if people are talking about suicide, certainly that's a warning sign for us. Are there any other warning signs that people are thinking about it? Sure, thank you. The increase in drug and alcohol use, absolutely. There's a lot of different things for us to be aware of for individuals that are struggling with thoughts of suicide, different warning signs. If you have any other ideas, again, please just go ahead and put that in the chat box. What I want to do now is share with you kind of general knowledge that we have about people who are struggling with thoughts of suicide and what they might put out there. Individuals will exhibit these thoughts of suicide through their actions, possibly through their physical appearance, maybe feelings that they're sharing with us or words that they're saying. Now, it's interesting when you look at this slide and you look in that top left corner and it says invitations. And that is a really, really interesting word, isn't it, when we think about the idea of suicide. And how might warning signs be an invitation? Well, that's exactly what they are. It's as if somebody who is struggling with thoughts of suicide is sending out an invitation to us. Maybe that invitation comes from that the use or increased use of alcohol or drugs. Maybe it is, Dan, as you had said, their words and how they're talking about it. Maybe they're not saying it directly, but they might be talking about how they say, I just can't take it anymore. Or we sense different feelings from them, that they feel worthless, or a key word here is hopelessness. When somebody talks about, or we get this sense of hopelessness from them, these are invitations. And I want you to think about it this way. If somebody had sent an invitation to you, if we had the opportunity to get together and we were going to be able to get together for a backyard barbecue and somebody sends an invitation to you, what is the expectation? when you receive that invitation from them. That expectation is usually that you RSVP, that you let them know that you're going to be there. Now, if you have sent that invitation to friends and family members, and there's that one friend that you didn't hear anything from, and there was no response back from them about their participation, that might be a little odd, and we wonder what that's about, and sure hope we hear from them. And then you get together maybe for the end of summer. It's the end of summer celebration. And again, you send out invitations to people. And once again, that friend doesn't respond, doesn't RSVP in any way. The likelihood of us sending an invitation to them to participate in, let's say, a Halloween get together, that becomes pretty slim, doesn't it? If they're not RSVPing, if they're not showing up, if they're not responding in some way, okay, I'm just not going to send that invitation again. That's exactly what it's like for an individual who is struggling with thoughts of suicide. If they are putting out these invitations, what we're seeing from their actions, what we're sensing from their feelings, the words that we might be hearing, or the physical changes that we're seeing, when those invitations are being put out and we're not RSVPing in any way, it's very unlikely that they will continue to send out those invitations. So that's why it is so important for us to recognize, to show up, to RSVP in some way and say, I see you, I hear you, let's talk about this. When we show up, it reduces risk. It makes a difference for people who are struggling with thoughts of suicide. So we have to be willing to ask some questions. You notice in that slide, it talked about the giving away of possessions. Well, imagine if it was someone that had been collecting those baseball cards for years, and then all of a sudden they're giving those baseball cards away. And we have to ask, what's that about? I know how important those are to you. I know how long you've worked on that. Tell me about why you're giving those away. When we recognize a change, when we sense that hopelessness, when we're seeing some physical changes, we've got to be willing to ask some questions about it. And the most important thing that we can ask is the question of suicide. So this is a way that we can RSVP, that we can show up. And please understand that when we ask this question, it's because of those invitations. This isn't something that's just coming out of the blue. It is because of those invitations that we're asking this question. So when it says when someone is, and again, using those invitations, when somebody is talking about being such a burden, and now you're giving away those prized possessions, and I know that you're struggling because of the loss of the job. You know, when somebody's going through those kind of things, they're sometimes thinking about suicide, and I need to know, are you thinking about suicide? So here's what I'm going to ask you to do. I want you to take a second and I want you to read that question to yourself. And then I want you to respond. How does that make you feel thinking about asking that question? How does it make you feel, the idea of asking that kind of a question? So after you've read that question to yourself and the thought of asking that question directly to someone, if you'll type in your chat box, how does it feel asking that question? Thanks, Lori. I appreciate that honesty. It makes us feel a little uneasy asking it. Absolutely. Maybe some of us feel kind of scared, a little scared. Really? Am I going to put that word suicide out there? Am I going to ask that question? Anybody else? How does it make you feel when you think about asking that question? Invasive. Jen, thanks. You know, I hear that one an awful lot, that people talk about, that it just feels like I'm being way too pushy. Not my business. And yet we're saying that That's exactly what it is. It should be our business. We care about the people around us, whether they're close to us in relationship, friends or family. Maybe it's a colleague. Maybe it's just someone that we work with in our community. They're sending out an invitation. How are we going to RSVP? And this is one of the best ways for us to RSVP. In fact, the research says that when we ask this question, this clearly and this directly, it reduces risk. There are some studies that say it reduces risk by 80%, others that it's about 50%. Regardless, it reduces risk because it says to somebody, I see you. I recognize that something's going on. And sure, it might feel a bit invasive, but I also want you to think about this. What else might it feel like for the individual who's struggling with those thoughts? What else might they feel when someone takes the time and is courageous enough to ask this kind of question? What else do you think it might make them feel? Maybe cared for, maybe heard or seen. That can make such a difference for individuals. So here's a few other questions that I want you to think about. And if you feel like putting your responses in the chat box, that would be fantastic. We'll just talk about these. But when we think about asking that question, why is it important to ask the question of suicide clearly and directly? Again, if you have any thoughts about this, please feel free to put it in your chat box. I'll just continue to share some of the ideas as well. When we think about asking the question that clearly and that directly, we're saying, I'm willing to talk about this. I'm not going to beat around the bush. I want to ask clearly and directly about suicide. And another thing to think about when we ask a question like this clearly and directly is permission giving. It's saying to that individual, I'm going to talk to you clearly and directly, and I want you to share information with me the same way. I want you to be clear and direct. A lot of times people will say, well, what if I ask, are you thinking about hurting yourself? And although we can start with that question, that isn't as clear and direct as the question of suicide. So we can start with, are you thinking about hurting yourself? But what I mean by that is, are you thinking of taking your life? Are you thinking of killing yourself? Are you thinking of suicide? We want to be clear and direct. Again, it lets them know I'm willing to talk about this, and it says be clear and direct back with me. Another question that I want you to think about is what might happen if we don't ask clearly and directly. If we're not willing to ask clearly and directly, it kind of says to that person, I don't know if you can handle this. I don't know if you really are ready for the information that I want to share. So again, being clear, direct says, bring it on. Let's have this conversation. And there's no getting around what it is that we're talking about. Again, I often hear from people, well, what if they don't respond clearly and directly back to me? Or what if I don't believe how they're answering the question? I go back to the invitations and I say, I let them know this is why I'm asking this question. This is what I'm seeing. This is what I'm hearing from you. These are things that are taking place in your life that I'm aware of. And that's why I'm asking this question, and I want to help you. And then finally, the question I think is really important is, why would it be important for a caring individual such as yourselves to be willing to ask this question? Think about that. Think if you were that person on the other side and you had a caring individual who showed up, who RSVP'd in some way, and they were willing to ask this question. You can see how it can reduce risk. A person can almost take a breath because maybe they can think about things differently because a caring individual was willing to ask the question this important question this clearly and this directly. So one of the things that we need to do when we ask the question clearly and directly is to let the person know there are things that we can do to help keep you safe. And there are some things that you can do as an individual to help keep yourself safe. And those come from coping skills. So while we're working on getting you connected with resources in our community, I also want you to think about what are some coping skills that you might have. Now, I want you as participants on this webinar to think about coping skills for yourself. I don't know about you, but I have had to engage in a lot of coping skills throughout this pandemic and the quarantining at home and the physical distancing. I've really had to engage in a lot of coping skills, kind of keep my own thoughts where they need to be. But let's think about what some of those coping skills are. Again, I'm going to ask you to participate by putting some responses in the chat box. I want you to give me some examples of what some of your coping skills are. I'll share with you, for me, my coping skills have been my garden. I love getting out there and digging in the dirt and pulling out the weeds and seeing what's growing. That has been such a tremendous help for me. Exercise, fantastic. That's so important. And we'll talk about the impact of exercise on our mental state as well. But some other ideas of coping skills for any of you. What are you doing? Walking the dog. Thanks, Dan. I love it. I've had more dog walking time with my granddog, my son and daughter-in-law, and their dog Elliot. We go on a lot of walks. Hunting and fishing, fantastic. I like that. Positive pictures, reasons to be happy, fantastic. You know, my husband's such a fly fisherman. I love that fishing is up there. That is his escape. That is his happy place. So I appreciate that's up there. And positive pictures, reasons to be happy. Just, it's amazing how those visual images can really kind of change our mindset. Maybe it's music, maybe it's journaling or cooking. You know, for some people, it's the opportunity to talk to friends, and talking with friends looks different now, but we have to be intentional about finding ways to make that happen. Other people, it might be playing video games. These are all things that are okay if it helps them with that coping, if it helps them understand what they can do to keep themselves safe right now. So thank you for talking about what some of those coping skills are. And the reason that I ask you to do that is I want you right now to write down 3 ideas of coping skills. I want you to think of 3 different ideas that you could do for yourself for coping skills. So I'm going to give everybody a couple of seconds here and come up with 3 different ideas. And the reason that I ask us to write down those 3 different ideas is that sometimes when we're talking with somebody who's struggling with thoughts of suicide, they might forget. They may not be able to come up with some of their own ideas of what coping skills are. And when you take the time, when you actually physically write something down, it kind of helps to ingrain it a little bit more in our brains. It might also be something that you can look back on and refer to and say, you know what? When I find myself really struggling, I know that when I just sit down and listen to music, that helps me. Is that something that might help you? We want to help individuals come up with their own ideas or provide suggestions. So that's why I'm asking you to write down 3 ideas of coping skills. Other things to keep in mind, and as was mentioned by Jen, that regular exercise. Physical activity has such a tremendously positive impact on our mental state. A study that was done in the University of Vermont talked about the physical activity, those exercises and structured exercise classes, how it improved their moods. But it doesn't even need to be a structured exercise class. It can just be getting outside. And when we get outside, we're walking on a trail, we're in a park, just maybe even just sitting on a bench and breathing in that air and enjoying nature. it reduces our stress levels, it boosts our mood, and it helps to fight depression. In fact, one of the studies says that physical activity, outdoor physical activity, can reduce situational depression by 64%. Think about the work that all of you do in Parks and Recreation. You're all about nature and physical activity and those coping skills. You're making a difference every single day. And when you've got somebody who's struggling with thoughts of suicide, I want you to understand the positive impact that you're having because of what you offer in your communities. So the other thing that we need to be aware of are resources. We're talking with this individual. We've asked clearly and directly about suicide. We're asking about different things that they might be able to do to keep themselves safe right now, but we're also saying, I have resources that I can connect you to that can help as well. Now, I've already shown the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline number. I'll show it one more time, but these are just some other resources that you can reach out to. For example, if you're working with a young person who is struggling with sexual identity or has identified as LGBTQ, the Trevor Project is an amazing resource, and they've got that 866 number, which is a 24/7 hotline number, as well as that text number. So they are available all the time. These are for young people up to the age of 19. If we're talking about adults, LGBTQ, there is the Transgender National Hotline, it's the LGBTQ National Hotline for them as well. You'll also see on this slide that I have the website for the Pennsylvania Suicide Hotlines. And on that website is every county and different hotlines or resources throughout the state that can support you if you needed to reach out to someone because you're dealing with someone struggling with thoughts of suicide and you want to connect them with resources to help keep them safe. And then, as I talked about before, different state fact sheets, just some other information about the scope of the issue. You know, another really interesting resource that's out there, it's called mantherapy.org. And the reason that I share this is it's really important for us to understand, again, when we think that about that statistic that I shared earlier, that white males complete suicide 7 out of 10 times. So they're more likely to complete suicide. The therapy for men can look different, and the conversation about mental health and suicide can look different. And mantherapy.org, it's a little avant-garde, it's a little unique, some fascinating posters and PSAs that they've got. I encourage you to look at it, and maybe it's a campaign that you can start in any of your communities, but another way to reach both our youth and our adult men in our communities. The other resources that I have are some articles. There's a fantastic article about the psychological impact on your workforce with this pandemic and the lockdown that we've seen through COVID-19. And then I also mentioned the research by Dr. Jansen and the impact of screen time, internet for our young people. If you're interested in either one of those articles, please send me an email. You can just shoot me an email and just write down articles if you want both of them. If there's one specific that you want, for example, the psychological impact or the teen research, just put that in the subject line and I will be happy to send you the links for those articles as well. The other thing that I'm hoping that you will be willing to do, I know that Dan has got for the CEUs, the survey that will be immediately following this, but if you would take the time to let me know how you think this went. This is a link to an eval for me. I would really appreciate it, and I know that Jen is going to put that in the comments as well. She's going to put that link for this evaluation information for me in the chat box. So if you would take the time to let me know how you think this webinar went, I would really appreciate it. Once again, I want to put up that suicide prevention lifeline, and I want to give you a few more details about this. So I want to go back to understanding the scope of the issue. I want us to understand how it's important for us to know kind of the statistics that I've shared. But the most important thing for us to remember is that one-on-one, our willingness to have the conversation about suicide, our willingness to talk about this. And when we RSVP, when we show up, when those invitations are present, when we're seeing them, hearing them, sensing them, when we're recognizing changes in an individual, that we talk about it and we be willing to ask clearly and directly the question of suicide. Know that this resource right here is available for you 24/7, regardless of where you live. But here's some important pieces of information about this suicide prevention lifeline. Every state has a suicide prevention lifeline. The area code on your phone is the state that will be that your call would be directed to. So for example, if you live in the state of Pennsylvania, but you've recently moved, say, from Massachusetts into Pennsylvania, if you're using your cell phone and it still has a Massachusetts area code on it, it's going to go to the Massachusetts state hotline number. So you'll just need to let them know that you need Pennsylvania. So just be aware that the area code of your phone will direct your call. The other thing to know when you call this number is that you get 2 prompts. The first one is for English and Spanish, and the second is for military. The second one for military is extremely important. If you're working with somebody who is either active duty or a veteran, and they're struggling with thoughts of suicide, and you use the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, know that there are individuals that are specifically trained to work with military folks. As I said, I've had the pleasure of training on military bases, but I quickly learned that as a civilian, my conversation sounds very different than the military speak. So that's why knowing that you have that resource for military is so important. I have given a lot of information. Hopefully I've given you an opportunity to really think about not only the scope of the issue, but different things that you can do to help somebody who might be struggling with thoughts of suicide. Really give you an awareness of the issue of suicide. And again, if you've got any questions, anything at all that I can answer for you, I would absolutely love to hear from you. In the chat box, you've got the link for that evaluation. You also have my email. Dan, thank you very much for putting that up there. If you want any of those articles that I mentioned, or if you just have questions that you want to take offline that I might be able to answer for you, I would really appreciate it. There's a lot of questions that we all have when it comes to suicide. The one thing that I'm hoping that you will all take away from this is that you can make a difference. Your willingness to participate in this conversation, your willingness to recognize when somebody might be struggling with thoughts of suicide, and your willingness to do something. Most importantly, ask that question clearly and directly, and know that there are resources out there to support you. So the other final thing that I will share with you is that I am a trainer for Living Works, which is a company out of Calgary, Canada. And I am a training coach and a consulting trainer in ASSIST, which is suicide intervention, as well as Safe Talk, which is a suicide awareness. The ASSIST is 2 consecutive full days of training, and the Safe Talk is a half-day training. So if you're interested in any of those trainings at all, let me know. I can let you know who might be trainers in your community, or possibly how I might be able to support you. So you have that evaluation information. Please send that to me. I would love to hear from you. And most importantly, I want to say, you can be the light at the end of the tunnel for someone. They might be living in a very, very dark tunnel. You can be the light. by your willingness to participate in this conversation, your willingness to respond, your willingness just to say, I care. Thank you so much for participating today. Thank you so much for your time and your willingness to engage in this conversation. Again, if there's any questions at all that you want to take offline, don't hesitate to shoot me an email. I'd love to hear from any of you, and I really appreciate your time. Dan, do you have any final things that you need to share?
I do, Lori. First of all, I want to thank you so much for joining us today and speaking about this very serious issue that we're all experiencing. And given the present situation, it's not going to go away soon.
You're absolutely right, Dan, and it's important that we recognize how much support we can provide to people in our community. So thank you for saying that.
And I want